I wasn't there to witness her confession, but the story leading up to it is intriguing. My mum was adopted, and my grandparents never kept it a secret. They loved my mum like their own. When she was growing up, she tried to find out as much as she could about her and her adopted brother's birth parents. Back in those days though, info like that wasn't exactly the easiest to find. My mum and uncle were brought to the orphanage with little to no info on each of their biological parents, or was elsewise requested to be kept secret. Eventually, my mum found enough info from notes she had gathered, like which families might have been most likely to be related to her, some property info one can find to the library, and just sort of pieces of the puzzle together over her life. She was able to find out she was part of a big family with lots of brothers and sisters. But for my uncle, he found out that his mother had died not long after placing him for adoption. By the time she had gathered all of this info and found this much out, my mum was married, had my older sister, and was pregnant with me. I can't remember exactly what it was she found out that led to it, or if she heard something from someone, but she got a phone number. That phone number went to the house of her biological mother. She called. The voice of a young boy answered. My mum asked for the name she knew, and she hears, "Yeah, wait a second. Hey mum, phone's for you." My mum and her mum talk. It wasn't an easy conversation, and I'm just gonna refer to my mum's mum as Bio-Gran from here. Bio-Gran is not comfortable with my mum contacting her at all. She doesn't ask my mum a lot of questions, but my mum says she was just gonna talk, and if Bio-Gran wanted to hang up at any point, she could. My mum gave her a short version of the story of her life, and then the conversation was over. Bio-Gran after that would send letters to my mum on occasion, but Bio-Gran made a point of telling my mum she could never be found out by the rest of her family, and Bio-Gran carried that secret with her till the day of her death. One of her daughters asked her, "Will you tell us where you went when you went away that time?" And Bio-Gran finally confessed. She had gone to a home for unwed mothers all those years ago to have my mum, the child of her affair. I've met two of my bio aunts, and sadly both of them passed a few years ago. But dang, my mum was the result of an affair with a milkman. The family was surprised about the affair, but my one biological aunt said that she had always sort of suspected that something had happened. Bio-Gran really just left with a suitcase one day and didn't come back for almost a year, and the milkman liked to brag, and he's the only reason my mum found out any actual names from her side. His bragging had survived long enough to be told from a friend of my grandpa's, and my mum, hearing this story, was very interested to get more detail, but she could only get this guy's best guess at last names. I think this guy liked to think he was more accomplished than some, by being sleazy and then telling everyone how sleazy he had been. From what I understand, he was doing some odd job for this guy who knew my grandpa, and that's where my grandpa's friend picked up the story. It was a heck of a time for my mum to get all of this. It was really just the two aunts that wanted to have any contact with us. The others didn't care or didn't want to. I ended up working in a building close to my biological uncle, but I haven't made any attempt to talk with him. The funny thing to me is I remember hearing jokes about milkmen with dubious intent, or seeing references to the whole dynamic in cartoons. It's just so crazy to me that that actually happened. My great-grandmother lived a very long and interesting life. She was in her 20s in the Great Depression. She had a wild streak from those days that we didn't know much about, to the point where we didn't know our great-grandfather's name, just the husband she took later. Over the course of her nearly 100-year life, she had collected owls, literally thousands of owl figurines. She had clocks, wall hangings, pot holders, lamps, stained glass art, salt shakers, and more little figurines than you could imagine, all depicting owls. We all wondered the importance of the owls. She never talked about them, we just all knew she loved owls. When she was nearing death, at the age of 98 or 99, and the doctors said she had days, My grandparents went and talked to her, and they asked her if she had anything she wanted to share or ask before she goes. She thought for a moment, then said, "I never understood the owls." It turns out she didn't really give a damn about owls. Near as we could piece together, sometime in the 40s or 50s perhaps, she bought either a trivet or a set of salt and pepper shakers that were owls. Then someone got her the other. Those were the oldest owls anyone could remember, but from there, someone got her an owl to match, probably a potholder or placemat, and all of a sudden her kitchen was owl-themed. From there, it snowballed. The owls flowed like wine, baffling her for 60 years, eventually taking over as the bulk of her personal belongings. The moral is, if you're not actually into something, mention it early. My great-aunt passed away a couple of years ago. She was suffering from viral encephalitis and fluctuated in and out of consciousness. It was truly painful to watch, although a lot of family tended to be around her in those days. I once happened to be alone with her when she made some fairly odd remarks, which I kept to myself. On the day in question, I was playing games on my phone in her hospital room when she started to audibly mutter to herself. It became more urgent and intense. Eventually, she explicitly called me to her side, her eyes looking huge and confused. I doubt she knew who I was. She spat out her words, most of which were barely comprehensible, putting particular emphasis on the boy and ingredient. I sat there for 15 minutes, listening to her erratic account of, as I finally gathered, how she sometimes used to cook eggs in the urine of a stable boy instead of water. She insisted that he was handsomely compensated for his services, but now and then she started to cry and couldn't stop. I googled this weeks later, and there indeed exists a traditional dish in China described in the West as virgin boy egg. Apparently, this concept had fascinated her, and she frequently recreated this herself and served it to her family, which sometimes included my younger self, without explaining what it was. I'm not sure if she felt shame or enthusiasm about this. She often stammered something about, quote, the secret ingredient, but it quite obviously haunted her towards the very end of her life. Around the time my grandfather was really declining, he started making strange remarks about a group of people that we were unfamiliar with, a lot of war stories, as well as the word kitchens over and over. He started talking about kitchens, and we just thought it was ramblings and nonsense. After he passed, when we were cleaning out their house, we came upon an old family book that was handwritten by his grandfather. It was about the Denver bootleggers, focusing on a certain character who managed to run one of the biggest bootlegging operations in the area during Prohibition. Then we came across some pictures in a box with a bunch of pins and a sash that was from the Masons. The pictures all had my grandfather and his father posing with family members, as well as a random old guy dressed in what can only be described as a 1940s era suit and hat that made him look like an old school gangster. We then found out that there is a house that my aunt used to go to when she was a very young child that was supposedly owned by that old man in the photos. When I did some scoping on the property, it does not have a registered number on the street it resides, and is instead registered as an address that is 1 block over. The house had no real address, and it is owned by a company that's run by some guy that my aunt and mum know to be related to us. At this point, we think the Kitchens was a pseudonym for something my grandfather was associated with within the Masons, and that this Kitchens fellow may be the man in the photos, as well as even the inspiration for the main character in the handwritten book we found buried in the closet. My grandmother was always a very miserable, self-centered woman. She got pregnant with my aunt before she was married to my grandfather, and they married and had my mother as well. Years pass. My aunt and mum leave home. My grandfather moves into my aunt's old room and they sleep separately. Older people have issues sleeping sometimes. My grandmother was apparently a bad snorer. No one thought anything of it. About 10 years ago, my grandfather starts acting strangely, repeating himself. Turns out to be cancer that was in his colon, spread to his bones and into his brain, killing him. Doesn't take long. He goes from hospital to hospice and gone in about 6 months. Grandmother is fairly cold and uncaring about it, and when he dies, keeps absolutely nothing of his except his lazy boy. Gets mad at my mother for wanting to keep his wedding ring, thinking she's going to pawn it and get money for it, and she wanted the money. About 8 years pass, her being demanding, rude, disgusting and pushy with my aunt and mother. She would sometimes have mini strokes and become wonky for periods of time, but recover after a day or so. This prompted her to mention a man my mum never heard of before. This tipped my mum off that she wasn't telling her something. Turns out, she had been married before my grandfather, and a few of her family members knew and even had some wedding photos, but she had had it annulled about a year before she met Grandpa. When asked about it, she absolutely denied it and changed the subject and never budged. Then, one day, my mum and her sister got a call. Their mother was in the hospital and it was not good. They met up and drove over, and she was acting a bit funny. Her kidneys were shutting down, and she had likely had a mini stroke a day or so before. They spoke with her, and although somewhat her miserable self, she turned to my mum and said, "You're right. I was married before. I loved him. We married, and soon after he quit his job and wanted me to work the streets and support him. I couldn't believe it, so I left him. I just didn't want to talk about it. It still hurts." She refused to say more apparently, and after my mum and aunt left, she was gone in about 8 hours. It makes me wonder, maybe because of that she was such a miserable person. It did always seem like she married my grandfather to be taken care of. He always worked, she never did, and I never even saw them hug, let alone kiss. Makes you think. My nana always hated Americans, despised them. She was in the British Royal Forces during World War II, and would tell me stories about the loud-mouthed, stupid American soldiers she had to deal with, and that I should never trust an American because, quote, "they're stupid and dangerous." This woman wouldn't even watch American TV shows or movies, hated Americans so much. This was a pretty big part of her personality. After she died in 2006, I found out she was actually engaged to an American soldier during the war. I don't know how long this soldier had spent in Britain, but at some stage, he had to leave to finish his tour and later to the US. After the war, she and her sister traveled to America from England so she could marry this man she was so deeply in love with, only to find him in a hospital after having both of his legs blown off in battle. Story has it that she still wanted to marry him, but he refused. He claimed that she deserved a man who could provide for her, not a, quote, invalid. Heartbroken, she returned to England and married my grandfather instead, who she never really liked. She always told me that the best years of her life were those in the Air Force during World War II. I guess now I know why. Turns out this guy was the love of her life. Her sister told my mum this story years ago and claimed that it was absolutely heartbreaking. Growing up, I had these elderly neighbors who my parents befriended while I was an infant. They would usually sit outside and drink coffee and visit with other neighbors that would stop by, chat, share treats and goodies. If you were really good friends, you could help work on puzzles with them in their family room. They would finish a 1,000-piece puzzle in a day. As I got older and started school, the grandmother neighbor, let's call her Mary, would babysit my sister and me after school, 2-hour late starts, etc. So needless to say, I spent more time with them than my actual grandparents. The old man, we'll call him Bob, was very hard of hearing, scrawny and small, where Mary was a big old gal and liked her desserts. They also lived with their adult son, who, because of medical reasons, couldn't live on his own, or so I was told. As I got older into my teenage years, I picked up on some of the old man's kind of pervy old man comments and his more vulgar mannerisms and language. I just thought old men were like that, reminiscing on their past sex life. Sports Illustrated lying about, objectifying comments about sports commentators and female athletes, etc., etc. Once I went to college and Bob died, my parents were helping Mary more and more around the house, and once their son fell ill and also passed away, Mary needed full-time care in a nursing facility. When she settled in, her son passed away, and she never recovered from it and also died. These three all passed away in the span of like 6 months. Devastating. My closest grandparent figures and uncle-like figure all died while I was away at school. Once things settled down, their house sold, and we adjusted to life without these family friends, my parents began telling me more and more about their dynamic. Turns out, Bob used to beat the hell out of Mary while their children were younger. I'm talking anytime, anywhere, kids present in the same room. He'd get drunk and walk around the house throwing empty bottles around, aiming for his kids, breaking their belongings. Just a piece of crap behavior. Well, once their adult son who lived with them got enough, he started to fight back, and he was much, much stronger than the old man. So he put an end to that BS for a while, until his younger siblings moved out, but still lived close to keep an eye on his mum. Years and years down the road, their son did have a medical condition which did require him to need some monitoring, think seizures and such. So that was a reason he lived as an adult with his parents, but he also stayed to keep his mum safe. Although I never saw any violence in their home, I heard some mean things said towards Mary, and looking back, I can see signs of past abuse. It's wild how some elderly people can portray a good image of themselves, all the while hiding a dark past. When my great-grandfather died, he left my cousins and me different boxes of his belongings he thought we might like. We were all interested in old history to some degree, so he left us with little knickknacks that he had collected in his long life. While my female cousins got jewelry and old photos and some old specs, and my male cousins getting old hats and coats with really old train tickets inside, I was left with a box that apparently held his prized gun. It was this old well-kept revolver that came in a small leather-bound journal that was practically spilling out with old photos and memoirs and other stuff. So apparently, back in the day of my great-granddad, his father was some kind of regulator at an old mining town. If you took too much of what wasn't yours, he would use that very same gun to go vigilante justice on your ass. After he died from some sickness though, my great-granddad was sent to live with some relatives who, according to him, were really the worst. And by the way, those guys took him in, but treated him like garbage. They were apparently shot to death and killed one night. It was kind of a tense subject in my family, because a whole lineage of our bloodline was cut short. Well, guess what? In his little journal, good old grandpa admitted to killing his aunt, uncle, and 3 of his cousins. From what I know and read, he fled to an entirely different part of the country immediately after the deed was done, stayed on the move for a while, and then finally placed himself far from his hometown to settle down. My dad was one of 13 out of 17 birthed children that survived. His brother, my Uncle Steve, was a merchant marine. He came home from a long at-sea period to find his wife knocked up. He left on his next assignment or voyage a while later and disappeared from the ship. Back then, maybe now too for all I know, merchant marines were a rowdy, boozy bunch when not actively doing their work on board the ship. My dad's family, including his pregnant wife, were informed that he was lost at sea. Whether he went in via accident or via a fight for cheating at cards, he was dead at sea. This was when my dad, who was born in 1933, was a kid. Steve was one of his much older brothers, as Dad was next to the youngest of the brood. The wife had the child of whoever it was, and the baby was embraced into the family as if his dad was her husband, not a rando. And he was my cousin, Grandma's grandson, and the whole 9 yards. He was embraced and absorbed into the family, and always was allowed to think of Steve as Dad. It was a family conspiracy, so he wouldn't feel different. Okay, so Steve had been dead for a long-ass time. My cousin was a fully grown adult, as was I. I believe my uncle even had a headstone in the graveyard, saying lost at sea and the year. One of the older siblings in my dad's family had a couple of kids, my much older cousins, a good 25 years older than the other cousin and me, and they decided to do a family tree thing. I don't know if they hired a PI or what, but it turns out poor Steve, lost at sea these many years, was actually living above a house of ill repute in New Orleans all this time. He had faked his own death, and this was discovered shortly after his real death there, of cancer at a ripe old age. So I had an uncle who died twice, once at sea after the discovery that his wife was knocked up by a rando dude, and once again around 50 years later, in his entirely new life that no one had ever guessed. My grandpa died a few years ago. He was an upstanding man, active in his community, and had a group of church guys that he would eat breakfast with every Saturday. He was as conservative and Republican as they come. If he were alive during the pandemic, he would 100% be an anti-masker and someone that would accuse COVID of being government control. He had a shed at the far end of his property. It was one of those giant shop-style sheds that look like they're only made of siding. When he finally passed, my family took the liberty of going through his things, hoping to find some tools or lumber that we could auction off to help my grandmother get back on her feet. We did not find tools. Instead, the shed was sectioned, heated, and irrigated to grow marijuana. I'm not talking a few plants, no. This man had a friggin' monopoly on weed. The walls were covered floor to ceiling in drying plants, and the part that made me cry was the folding chair in the far corner, hidden by rows and rows of cannabis, surrounded by discarded stems and leaf clippings, where he sat and plucked every seed and stem out of his prized bud. We also found a guitar case full of porno mags, but the weed was much cooler. Three months after my grandmother died, there was a knock on the door. When my aunt answered, this lady said she was looking for my grandmother. My aunt apologized and told her my grandmother had passed away and invited her inside. When inside, the woman informed her that she was put up for adoption and decided to trace her birth parents. Her birth parents were my grandparents. None of my aunts or uncles knew about this sibling. My grandfather was still alive and told us they were very young and didn't really have an option, and from the day they gave the baby away, they never spoke of it again, not even to each other. Okay, understandable. Until 2 years later, when another knock came to the door. This time, a man with the exact same story as the lady. He was 14 months younger. Both turned out to be my grandparents' biological children. Neither of these two people had ever known each other, and both grew up in different countries, one Canada and the other USA. We're in Ireland. grandfather had died before the second, so we can only assume there were just 2 babies given up for adoption. My uncle had a friend when I was younger who was a very quiet old man named Dickie that had a cool powder green Monte Carlo that he used to bring around all the time. He died when I was in middle school, and he always just seemed like a shy, sweet old dude. Years pass, and sadly my uncle died too, and one night my aunt starts talking about Dickie with the Monte Carlo. I bring up how sweet he was, and it was like the colour left my aunt's face. I asked her what's wrong, and she says she thinks Dickie killed someone when they were younger. I obviously asked her to elaborate. Apparently, back in the 1950s, there was a gruesome killing that took place in our town of a high school girl who happened to be a friend of my aunt. The girl who was killed was found on an old country road covered in a burlap sack. For whatever reason, the case was never solved and the murderer was never caught. My aunt claims that she knows Dickie did it. He lived on the road the body was found on. His family were farmers and had access to the sacks the body was covered with, and was known to be a loner, creep type, and had a crush on the girl. All of this could just be coincidence, she had said, but in the days after the murder, Dickie and some other boys were questioned, but cleared of any suspicion because they had said that they were at a bonfire that most of their high school class had been at. But my aunt said she never saw him that night, but had seen the other boys that were questioned. My aunt says that she had brought the killing up around Dickie a few times over the years, and each time he would grow cold and change the subject. She told me she could see it in his eyes. I asked her why she never told the police about never seeing Dickie at the bonfire the night of the murder, and she claimed she had been convinced otherwise by my uncle at the time, which implies that he must have known Dickie did it and was covering for him, which adds to the horror for me. Not only do I believe my aunt, but the fact my uncle may have known about Dickie's guilt or had aided him in some way makes me shiver to this day. My paternal grandfather had a brother, and this would be my great-uncle. When the brother was about 15, around 1905, the brother's friends were involved in a robbery. He ran away because the friends told him if he didn't lie for them, they would say he was involved. He ran away from West Virginia and ended up in Texas. A few years later, he met a young lady. He told her he was a runaway. She suggested they marry, and he take her last name, and they also gave him a new first name. They settled in Texas, had a few children, then moved back to West Virginia with his new name about 20 years after he first left. They moved right across the street from us, across the road from his own brother, my grandpa. To continue the cover-up, my grandpa treated him like a new neighbor, never as his brother. We were told to call them uncle and aunt out of respect. We all just thought they were very close friends. No one ever let on that he was related to us. I never knew until he died, and his children were grown and gone. Even his own kids never knew. We were all very close and all found out at the same time. It was a stunned, shocked silence. When my granddad passed away, he never told us anything about his past, where he was born, lived, owned, anything. He even changed the family last name. But my dad and aunt never realized because they were too young at the time, but once we found that, things started falling into place. We had a picture of granddad, grandma, great-grandma, and my dad as a kid in front of a house, but didn't know where it was. But we had a holiday place rented 30 minutes from the city and decided to investigate. We found the house, took a picture, and noticed it even had the same sign on top, as it was a bed and breakfast. Moments later, out of the window a head popped up, a granny. We talked, joked and blah blah. Then my dad gave it a shot. Yes, we are investigating about a family name. Ever heard of it? She thinks for a second. No, never heard of it. But there was a woman called great-grandma's name, by the last name something different. Long story short, the grandma was a kid when they came here, and their family evicted our family when the war came and took the house for themselves, and she has not moved in 70 years. We knew Grandad was loaded, but not that loaded. The house was in the family for 500 years, at least, and it was the first house in the area, as in the house number was 1, and the second house number was 1 kilometer away originally. Then, after the war, my granddad's mother's place was forcefully taken away 1 week after her death, and a new tenant was already in there, claiming to be the owner. Called the police, and they escorted my dad, granddad, and uncle away. It was around mid-war times, and the government simply took whatever they wanted. The apartment was a luxury flat, 1 of 9 in the center of the city. Then we learned that we still own a plot of land, which is now a parking lot, owned by the county. The grave where 3 generations of family is buried, which we have been paying rent. It was upkeep as we actually own the gravesite, and as soon as we heard that, we got offers, lowball ones. But the lawyers told us we can name any price we want, as the plots are casket-sized, and again, city center. The entire building, Grandad's brother basically sold or gambled away. A bag of jeweler's gold went missing. Grandad's brother sold it to live in Monaco for 3 years. We all learned this last year when my aunt, Dad's sister, wanted to sell everything. Why? Because she took a loan 30 years ago on her apartment and never repaid back, which led to her and my uncle getting evicted. She owned more than she could have made in 3 lifetimes. There are many stories like this over the past 20 years, as the younger generation is learning about these things and started claiming things the government took. The one that I know of at the top of my head is of a guy who lives in Australia, maybe, and learned that the government took the house of his great-grandfather or something, which was in Central Europe. The house at this point was a police station, and basically, he evicted the police out of the building, which was very recently renovated. There is now a heritage law in action, where, with enough proof, heritage papers and such, you can take everything back, and we are really close to taking literally everything. Just the lawyers' fees are crippling us, thus it's taking quite a long time. When my paternal grandmother was dying, she said that her husband confessed on his deathbed to murdering his son. Not hers, he's from another woman. She had always been told it was an accidental drowning. The disturbing part is, before they were married, his son was engaged to my grandmother. My grandfather confessed that he murdered his son so that he could marry her. It's creepy to know that the only reason I exist is that my grandfather murdered his son to marry and have kids with my grandmother. If he hadn't, my father wouldn't have been born, and neither would I. It keeps me up at night sometimes, honestly. She met my grandfather's son when she was young. She was only around 17 at the time. Yeah, the age gap between her and my grandpa is ick. Shortly after they announced their engagement, my grandpa took his son on a fishing trip to celebrate. When he came back, he said his son slipped and hit his head, fell in. What more likely happened is, well, I don't know, but he probably knocked him out and threw him in the lake. He claimed he was a poor swimmer and tried to save his son but couldn't. The police didn't look too far into it and ruled it as an accidental drowning. I don't know how he convinced my grandmother to marry him after, but I suspect it was easy to emotionally manipulate a grieving young woman. So yeah, this came out in her last days. My grandfather had passed not too long before her. I don't know if the shock of the news made her follow so quickly, but she was devastated and nothing could be done about it at this point. I was always curious about my dad's side of the family, But my mum told me repeatedly that they weren't good people. The kid in me thought she was trying to keep me away from them for no good reason, but she was right and didn't want to see me get hurt. I should have listened. My grandpa's stepmom, who we strangely weren't allowed to visit very often, despite her being super nice, died when I was in middle school. Apparently, my grandpa was afraid of her as a child. He could always hear her muttering strange words when she thought no one was listening, and would often put curses on people. Like she'd tell someone she was mad at, "You're going to die tomorrow." And sure enough, that person did die. I know it sounds like a coincidence, but a few years later she did it again, and again, and again. And each and every time that person died, either in a car crash, in their sleep, at work, wherever they were, they all died. On her deathbed, she insisted that a female family member stayed with her until she died, and said, "I need to give these powers to someone." Everyone was afraid of her, so no one did. Could be a coincidence, but like I said, everyone she cursed died the next day. Eerie. My granddad used to have a vegetable garden and greenhouse. He grew all sorts, but especially loved eating his pea pods and strawberries. Always grew them bigger than anyone else, and always tasted lovely. Many years after his passing, I was speaking with my uncle, who informed me the reason he grew such good fruit and veg was because he used dead cats to fertilize his soil. Not only that, but he killed them himself if he'd see them in the backyard. Being a cat lover, this broke my heart, but also made me sick, thinking that I had eaten food grown from soil where there was many cats buried. I took training as a hospice nurse, mainly to take care of my parents who were very ill themselves. I had to do some time as an actual hospice nurse to get the certification, so I worked for a local hospice as a part-time nurse. One fellow was in his final days and kept asking for his family to come. Typical thing, we're trying to contact the family to be there, but they're often either no longer living themselves or some distance away. He kept asking because there was something he needed to tell them. Eventually, he just spilled his guts to myself and the pastor from the church he belonged to, Baptist I think. He told how back in the 50s or 60s, he had killed someone, and because his father was with the police, they had never charged him. In fact, some completely innocent guy had been found guilty and went to the electric chair for the murder. We'll call my aunt Anne. We'll call her sister, my other aunt, Betty. Anne was very religious. Betty was not. Anne and Betty had a childhood friend named Carol. Carol married John. Betty moved away from their home 2 decades ago, so Anne, Carol and John were much closer in friendship over the years than Betty. When John died, he confessed to Carol and my aunt Anne that his somewhat radical but clandestine group of friends was responsible for an abortion clinic bombing which caused a death. Aunt Anne was actually proud of him and told him so, and then later told my Aunt Betty all about his confession and the various details of this so-called group of friends, and that in the eyes of God, Carol and John and abortion clinic bombers were heroes. My Aunt Betty went right to the authorities with as many details as possible, because even though it had been years since the event, all of these details could help tie together other bombings, confirm suspects not caught, help tie together identities of friends still living, etc. Don't know the outcome, but she didn't hesitate at all sharing the facts with law enforcement because she was so appalled. My mum was from China, though we are now happily residing in a European country. We went back to China for my grandmother's last few weeks, as she was dying from terminal cancer. On my grandma's last days, she requested that mum stay with her alone, and it was only then she revealed that my mum wasn't her biological kid. My grandma confessed that she had bought my mum from a child trafficking ring, which was common in China, because she had tried for many years and still couldn't get pregnant. My mum cried a lot, not only for the unimaginable pain that her biological parents likely went through in losing a baby, but also for the fact that my grandparents had gone beyond to treat my mum as their little princess. They literally did treat my mum as their own. They were never abusive and only gave her the best in life. They even willingly sent my mum to the US for university education, even though they aren't rich by any means. My mum actually did consider looking for her biological parents, but after so many decades, the possibility of success is close to zero. Who knows if her biological parents are still alive? Plus, even if mum successfully found them, it's going to be extremely awkward interacting with someone you're supposed to love with all your heart, but don't, because you've never lived together with them during your formative years to develop the special bond. I suppose no one knows whether she was kidnapped or sold. Logically speaking, the latter might be more probable, because poor couples tend to sell their girls rather than boys. It would be kind of weird if mum goes looking for parents who didn't want her in the first place. However, my mum gives the benefit of the doubt and assumes that she was taken away from her parents because resentment is pointless and painful. On his deathbed, I was told by my father that in addition to 2 other kids he had that I knew of, there were more children of his out there. Also, that only 2 of his kids were with the same woman. 4 of them showed up at his service, in addition to the other 2, making it 7 of us present. We also found out that he may have had other kids elsewhere, but my family kept really poor records of things, so I never found out who they are. Most of that was word of mouth from old friends of his. Weird note, but all of us get together and now stay in contact. We had a good amount in common and see each other when we can. My aunt watched her elderly mother fall down the stairs and confess just before she died that she wasn't her biological mother. She told my aunt that her oldest sister was actually her mother. The sister had gotten pregnant too young, and the mum said it was hers. A common way of handling it back then. She revealed it in her very last breath. My great-uncle actually confessed to having 2 illegitimate sons right before he kicked the bucket in front of his own children and grandchildren. The crazy thing was that none of his children knew this life of his. Not even my great-aunt knew about it because she would have made a huge fuss if she was alive at the time. What was crazier was that these 2 sons already had passed away 5 and 7 years ahead of him respectively. He was 98 years old, and his invisible sons were 65 and 69. The children found out that one of his sons actually was a teacher at a school that his granddaughters attended when they were in high school. Nevertheless, they decided to reach out to them. They got connected and learned more stuff about my great-uncle. The craziest thing was, I actually dated one of the granddaughters of one of the invisible sons, the one that passed away at the age of 69 years old. Talk about a few degrees of separation. I worked for a federal law enforcement agency. We covered major felonies, some of which related to organized crime, not mafia per se, but open-ended criminal enterprises. We had a mid-level player as suspect for a string of cargo thefts, robberies, etc. I knew him for years, arrested him several times. He taught us a fair bit, but lung cancer got hold of him before we could build a solid case. Things went downhill fast. I went to see him at home just before he transferred to a hospice. The fact he did at least 50% of what we suspected is an open secret. I knew it, he knew it. For whatever reason, he chose to give me a break. He said, "If I give you something, will you sit on it for a few weeks?" Initially, I couldn't agree. What if he was going to leak info about something in progress, etc.? He assured me that it could wait, so I agreed. So he said, "I know that you're looking at me for such and such. I didn't do it." He admitted to wanting to do it and told me who was responsible and where we could find solid evidence to implicate 5 or 6 people. Why did he tell me? He said the other guy never really treated anybody right. I didn't ask him to elaborate. I moved on the information about 3 weeks later, after the informant died. I never had to share info about the source, because he pointed us to substantial corroborating information. When my partner had cancer, most of his 4 daughters from a previous marriage made it about them. Once they made some meals and brought them over. Facebook posts galore about how they cooked 20 meals. For weeks after, they came to visit during treatment in another town. They made it impossible as they could for me to see him. They told him not to cry because it upset them and lots of other stuff. When he was on palliative care, he didn't want to tell them at first. After a week, he asked me to tell them. They all arrived with partners and kids. They were upset they couldn't stay with us, all 15 of them. They blamed me for keeping them away from their dad. After all, quote, "They were there first, and it's their special time as a family." Their special time was to sit in the same room as him all day, talking and laughing between themselves, ignoring their dad, waking him up during the day because they thought that he wouldn't sleep that night. An hour before he died, my partner's last words were, "We should never have told them I was dying. It would have been so much easier without them, and I hate how they treat you. By the way, 3 are not mine. First wife had lots of affairs. Call me a bitch, but I wish they had heard every word." I'm 57, and my husband was 18 months younger. We met in 2011 after we both divorced other people. We had both been married for more than 26 years. My husband was amazingly charming. He always had a great story to tell. He grew up in Africa, then moved to Brazil, then to Canada when he was a young teenager. His family is Portuguese and he is the youngest of 2. He has a sister who is 4 years his senior. His young life had been so amazing. I loved hearing his stories. He also told me he had built a small company that had done very well when he and his wife lived in Vancouver in the 1990s. He went through a corporate bankruptcy as a result of a consultant he brought on that somehow managed to tank the company. He started again and did very well working for others. We met in 2011 and married in late 2014. We both had 2 daughters from our marriages, and they were all adults at the time. I loved this man more than life itself. He was so incredibly kind. When I found out I had a sensitivity to gluten, he ran out and bought all kinds of gluten-free foods. When I broke my leg in 2 places in 2018, he took care of me, literally carrying me at times from room to room. He was always doing small, caring things. I could not believe how lucky I was to have found someone like him. I told myself that every day. He was not sick before he died. He was taking no medications at all. He had a cardiac-related incident that was quite rare in August of 2020. He called me from the car. I could hear him driving. He said he thought he was having a stroke. I said, "For the love of God, pull over and call 911. He said he was coming to me, to my work. I met him on the side of the road. He was clutching his chest. He said the pain was intense. I said, "You're not having a stroke, you're having a heart attack." I had a low dose of aspirin in my purse, and I gave him 2 while we waited for the ambulance. It came. They treated him in the ambulance and told me it was not a heart attack and that they were taking him to the hospital. While we were in the car, I asked him if the code to his phone was such and such. He said yes. I said, I'll probably need your phone if you're going to be in hospital for a few days. He looked up at me and said, I'm so sorry. I thought it was an odd thing to say, but I also believed that he was sorry for leaving me in this position without him. He had emergency surgery that night at 12:30 a.m. The surgeon told me 25% of people do not survive the surgery. If he made it overnight, he would probably be okay. That night when I went home, I was a zombie. I stayed up all night waiting to get a phone call from the hospital telling me he didn't make it. He did. They put him in ICU, and the doctor told me that they would have to wait for the sedation to wear off to see if he had had a stroke while he was being operated on. I said, what? Why would he have a stroke? He said that sometimes happens. The stroke team at the hospital gathered, and as the days went by, it became apparent he was not okay. His sister flew out from British Columbia, and his mother came as well. My husband had suffered a watershed stroke, or several, while he had been operated on. He was never going to be okay. 7 days later, we took him off the ventilator. I was absolutely devastated. We had been married just short of 6 years. His mum and sister stayed with me for 3 weeks. He was cremated. I went home one day while his family was still with me and gathered all of his old phones. He had kept them all in a box in the study. I couldn't believe how old some of them were. I wanted to look through the texts we had sent each other, etc. It was an activity that really made me smile. I loved looking at our old correspondence. Then something made me look at the calls he had made. I was holding a phone from 2016. I had no idea why I looked at the calls, but I did. I actually felt guilty doing it. There were several calls to and from the same number, every weekday in the morning on his way to work, and every weekday on his way home, for 1.5 to 2 hours each. I thought to myself, this doesn't seem right. I looked at the name. I didn't recognize it, just an initial and last name. I called the number. It was disconnected, but a name popped up on the screen, Heather. I immediately realized he had been having an affair. He had saved all of his passwords on the computer we used for our small business. I went into his email and searched for her first and last name. I found 2 email addresses he had sent to himself. They had hundreds of screenshots attached from BlackBerry Messenger conversations with this woman. I sat there staring at the phone, reading about their affair, looking at him telling her he loved her, looking at her saying the same, looking at pictures of this woman that were in the chats. I learned where she worked, and also learned she was just 30 years old. My husband was 55. I read about them meeting every Wednesday to have sex in hotel rooms or in our car. They corresponded on every vacation we had been on from 2016 to 2019. I learned the affair was nearly 3 years long, out of a marriage that was not quite 6 years in length. I was stunned. He had been leaving work at noon. He was an executive and would not have to be questioned. Meeting her in the city we lived in, which was 2 hours from where he worked, and taking her out to lunch, going to the mall with her, visiting hotel rooms, etc. I ended up telling his sister about this because I felt I was having a heart attack myself. They went home 2 weeks later and I was left alone. The computer in the study was one that I never touched. He had created databases on this that ran the small business we owned. I was actually afraid to touch it. I knew nothing about the work he was doing. I decided to sit at that computer. This was a few months later. I was thinking of selling the company and I wanted to see what was on the computer. What I found were hundreds of recorded telephone calls with this woman, from the day they met until 2.5 years later. I listened to them. It took forever. Most of it was mundane talking, but a lot of it was arguing, bitter arguments. I also found out she had told him she was pregnant. He was devastated. He told her he did not want children and did not want another wife. He was not going to leave me. She threatened him with child support. then threatened him by asking him to, quote, give up his parental rights. Then a month or so later, she makes a statement that she's doing something terrible. The chat stopped. She had a termination. Now, the recordings were on his phone for everyone he had ever spoken to, not just this woman. He had neatly put everything into their own folder. Me, his employer, my daughter, this woman. Everyone had their own folder, and all of the discussions he had had with these people during that time were there. It was so surreal. I made the decision to call her. I knew where she worked, thanks to photos she had sent him at her workplace, but I didn't trust myself enough to go there and not to yell and scream like an idiot. I lied to her, told her he had many girlfriends, and she was just one in a bunch. I told her he was a master manipulator, and that what she thought she had with him, she didn't. I generally made her feel like crap, and then ended the call. Not my best moment, but I felt it was the right thing to do. I asked her if she had birthed a baby, and she blurted out no. I then explained to her that he had died. I ended up finding and contacting her husband. They had separated in 2018. He was stunned at the information I had. I sent him all of the screenshots and all of the recordings. I thought he deserved to know the truth. My stepdaughter came by one night, and I gave her a number of her father's things. I was telling a story, one he had told me multiple times, and she told me it wasn't true. I doubled down because I was sure everything he had told me was in fact true, and then I realized he had been lying to me. I contacted his ex-wife and met with her. She held my hand and cried when I told her about the pregnancy and the 30-year-old. I asked her about the story. She said it wasn't true. I found out that day that nearly everything he had told me about his life, with the exception of living in Africa and Brazil, was a lie. He did not own a company. They did not own a property. He did not have a thriving career before he met me. He had been on social assistance for years at the time. I was stunned a second time. I thought the girlfriend was my only concern, but now I realized I didn't know this man at all. To make matters worse, months after meeting with his wife, I found a business card for a therapist he had been seeing. I knew he was in therapy. He had PTSD, or so he told me. On the therapist's card it said, specializing in affairs and sex addiction. That made me think this one girl was not the only affair he had. I sent the therapist a letter from my lawyer with the death certificate and naming me as the beneficiary of his estate, hoping they would release his therapy records. His therapist didn't reply, so I thought that I would call and make an appointment and tell him I wanted the records. I did that, and he said he was waiting for me to call. He would not release the records on paper, but he would tell me whatever I wanted to know and not charge me. I spoke with him twice. I found out he had several affairs while married to his first wife. He had been doing this since they were married. I also found out he was gay. He had been going to bathhouses and seeing men since he was in his early 20s, unprotected. The sex he had with women was usually unprotected as well. I had a full range of STI testing. Thankfully, all was okay. I contacted his ex-wife and told her what I'd found. I told her to be tested. She was devastated. She asked me not to tell his kids, and of course I will not. I called public health and told them to contact his 30-year-old girlfriend. She needed to be tested. She was having more sex with him than I was. I told them to let her know he had been having unprotected sex with men. I feel I went over and above with this woman. I didn't need to make her aware of this at all. I reconnected with her ex-husband and told him he should also be tested. He thanked me. His therapist told me he believed my husband lied to him a lot. He said my husband would make appointments, not show up, reschedule, show up late. He was completely unreliable. That in and of itself is odd to me because he was a stickler for being on time, and he was very professional about it. He believed my husband was using women to convince himself he wasn't gay. He stopped short of telling me he was a sociopath, but I have my suspicions. I sold our condo and moved to another city. I'm trying to live day to day with the knowledge that the man who I thought was the man I had been waiting for my entire life was someone I didn't know at all. Everything he had told me was a lie. Absolutely everything. Thousands of dollars are missing from his account. Our accounts were separate. I have no idea where the money went or what he spent it on. I suspect he was taking women and men out for dinners, paying for hotel rooms, etc. I think every day that there is likely more to this story that I don't know, and that really scares me. I don't think I can take much more. Writing this out has been cathartic, and I am of course in therapy myself. I've blown through 3 therapists since he died. I'm trying another the first week of November, and I hope I connect with this person. Thinking back on what he said in the car that night, "I'm sorry," meant he knew I would find the affair, and likely other things on his computer. He didn't have the courage to tell me anything while any of this was going on, yet in death, he felt he should apologize. How incredibly selfish and sad. Someone on Reddit made the statement, "Your husband dies in lies and deceit." They were right.